Customers barely noticed James Fletcher as he stocked the shelves at QuickMart. At 62, with gray hair and weathered hands that told stories of decades at sea, he moved through his duties with quiet efficiency. His blue work shirt bore the name tag, Jim, though few bothered to read it. Behind his calm hazel eyes lay memories of commanding destroyers through rough waters, but here in aisle 3, he was just another aging worker counting down to closing time. Then came the night that changed everything, when two desperate kids with a toy gun discovered they'd picked the wrong store to rob. The convenience store sat on the corner of Maple and 3rd, serving a working-class neighborhood where people came for necessities and left without lingering. James had worked there for 3 years, ever since his Navy pension proved insufficient for rising living costs. The transition from bridge commander to night shift stalker hadn't been easy, but he'd learned to keep his head down and his mouth shut about his past. Every morning at 6 a.m., James would arrive early, brewing the first pot of coffee and checking the cash registers. His manager, Mike Gonzalez, a 45-year-old Hispanic man with a thick mustache and slightly overweight frame, appreciated James's reliability but never asked about his background. To Mike, James was just the quiet guy who never called in sick and never complained about working holidays. He arranged cans of soup with military precision, each label facing forward, each row perfectly aligned. Old habits from his days as a chief petty officer died hard, though no one here knew about that chapter of his life. 26 years in the Navy, including 2 tours in the Persian Gulf and countless missions he couldn't discuss even if anyone cared to listen. Now his greatest challenge was making sure the energy drink cooler stayed stocked and the lottery tickets were properly secured. The loneliness hit hardest during the evening shift. James would watch families come in together, teenagers laughing with friends, couples holding hands as they picked out snacks for movie night. He'd been married once, Sarah had waited through his first deployment but couldn't handle the second. No children, no grandchildren, no one to call on Sunday afternoons. Sometimes, during the quiet hours, his mind would drift back to the USS Portland, the destroyer he'd served on during his final tour. He remembered the weight of responsibility, the lives that depended on his decisions, the respect in young sailors' eyes when he taught them navigation or emergency procedures. That man felt like a stranger now, someone from another lifetime who bore little resemblance to the invisible stalker in aisle 3. "Excuse me," a young customer said, reaching around him for a bag of chips. The kid was maybe 22, Latino, with respectful eyes that reminded James of the young sailors he'd once mentored. James stepped aside without a word, invisible as always. But something in the young man's polite "thank you" stirred a memory of Tony Martinez, the kid who'd started working part-time at the store last month. Tony was studying business at the community college, working nights to pay tuition, and treating everyone with a respect that reminded James why he'd once loved training new recruits. The rain drummed against the store windows as James counted down the final hour of his shift. It was past 10 p.m. on a Thursday, and the usual late-night crowd had thinned to nothing. Mike had left an hour earlier, trusting James to handle the closing routine alone, a responsibility that spoke to 3 years of proven reliability, even if Mike had never bothered to learn James's full story. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the empty aisles. James was restocking the cigarette display behind the counter when he heard the electronic chime of the front door. 2 figures entered, both wearing dark hoodies pulled low over their faces. Something in their body language triggered an instinct James hadn't used in years. The taller one, about 6 feet 2 inches with an athletic build, headed toward the back while scanning the ceiling corners for security cameras. The shorter one, stocky and nervous, lingered near the front door. James's hands continued their work, but his mind shifted into a different mode entirely. In the Navy, he'd been trained to assess threats within seconds, to read situations that could mean the difference between life and death for his crew. "Hey, old man," the tall one called out, approaching the counter with his right hand concealed in his jacket pocket. "Empty the register. Now." James's expression remained calm, but his heart rate slowed rather than accelerated, another old military response. He'd faced down pirates in the Strait of Hormuz and stared down the barrel of a rifle during a boarding operation gone wrong. A convenience store robbery was dangerous, yes, but it was also familiar territory in ways these kids couldn't imagine. That's when James noticed something that changed everything. As the robber shifted his weight, his sleeve rode up slightly, revealing a small tattoo on his wrist, an anchor with "Mom" written beneath it. It was fresh, still healing, and something about it reminded James of the scared 19-year-olds who used to report to his division on their first day of boot camp. These weren't hardened criminals. They were desperate kids making a terrible mistake. "Listen," James said, his voice taking on a tone he hadn't used in 3 years, the voice of a chief petty officer addressing young sailors who'd screwed up but weren't beyond redemption. "You don't want to do this." That's when Tony Martinez walked in, calling out, "Hey Mr. Fletcher, sorry I'm late." He stopped mid-sentence, taking in the scene. The shorter robber panicked, and the tall one pulled his hand from his pocket to reveal a plastic water gun spray-painted black. "Boys," James said, stepping out from behind the counter with an authority that transformed him completely, "sit down. Right there on the floor. We're going to wait for the police together." "Boys," James said, and something in his tone made both robbers stop moving. "Sit down. Right there on the floor. We're going to wait for the police together, and I'm going to tell you a story about what happens when good people make bad choices." The shorter robber looked ready to bolt, but the tall one seemed frozen by something he couldn't quite identify. There was something about the old man now that reminded him of his grandfather, a Korean War veteran who died when he was 12. The same quiet confidence, the same sense that this person had seen things and done things that commanded respect. They sat. They actually sat down on the convenience store floor and waited. Officer Patricia Johnson arrived within 10 minutes, her squad car's lights painting the store windows in alternating red and blue. She was a 15-year veteran of the force who'd grown up in this neighborhood and knew every regular customer at QuickMart by name. She'd also been wondering about the quiet night shift worker for months, something about him triggering her cop instincts in a way she couldn't quite pin down. "James," she called as she entered, one hand resting casually on her weapon. "Everyone okay here?" "Everyone's fine, Officer Johnson," James replied, standing between the two seated robbers like a drill instructor overseeing recruits. "These young men attempted to rob the store with a toy gun. I think they've had enough excitement for one evening." Officer Johnson looked from the fake weapon on the counter to the two subdued would-be criminals, then back to James. Something clicked in her mind, the way he stood, the way he'd taken control of the situation, the calm authority that seemed to radiate from him despite his work uniform and name tag. "James Fletcher," she said slowly, pieces of a puzzle falling into place. "Any relation to Chief Petty Officer James Fletcher, USS Portland?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Tony looked confused, the two robbers looked bewildered, and James felt something shift inside his chest. It had been 3 years since anyone had called him by his real name, his real rank. "That would be me," he said quietly. Officer Johnson's entire demeanor changed. She came to attention in a way that had nothing to do with police protocol and everything to do with the respect one service member shows another. "Sir," she said, "I did my reserve training on communication protocols with the Pacific Fleet in 2008. Your reputation for training excellence preceded you even then. The instructors used to say that sailors trained by Chief Fletcher never forgot their lessons." The convenience store suddenly felt different, charged with the weight of recognition and respect. Tony stared at his coworker with new eyes, trying to reconcile the quiet stock clerk with this person who commanded immediate deference from a police officer. "Officer Johnson," James said, "I think these boys would benefit more from a conversation than from arrests. They're scared, they're desperate, and they made a mistake. But they didn't hurt anyone, and they're sitting here quietly instead of running because they know they messed up." She looked at the two young men, then back at James. "What are you suggesting, Chief?" "I'm suggesting that sometimes the right lesson is worth more than the right punishment. If you're willing, I'd like to talk to them. Really talk to them. And if they're interested in turning this night into something better than a criminal record, I might be able to help with that." Word spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. By the next morning, the story of the night shift worker who turned out to be a decorated Navy veteran had reached every household within 6 blocks. But it wasn't just the story that spread, it was the questions and the recognition. Mrs. Rodriguez was the first to return to the store the next day. At 65, with her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun and wearing her favorite floral dress, she approached the counter where James was working with a mixture of embarrassment and curiosity. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, her voice carrying the slight accent that revealed her Mexican heritage, "I wanted to apologize. I've been shopping here for 3 years, and I never really talked to you. I just assumed you were just another old guy working retail." "That's exactly what I was trying to be, Mrs. Rodriguez," James said with a gentle smile. "Sometimes it's easier to be invisible." "But why?" she asked. "Why would someone like you want to be invisible?" James paused in his restocking, considering the question. "Because when you've spent your whole adult life being responsible for other people's lives, sometimes you just want to blend in. Sometimes you want to be normal." It was the first real conversation James had had with a customer in 3 years, and it opened something inside him that he thought was permanently closed. Throughout the day, more neighbors stopped by. Mr. Peterson, the retired teacher who lived 2 blocks away. The young couple from the apartment complex who always bought their groceries on Saturday mornings. Even teenagers who'd never paid him any attention suddenly seemed curious about the man behind the counter. Tony Martinez became James's unofficial translator for this new attention. The young man had been shaken by the previous night's events, but he was also fascinated by the revelation about his coworker. "Mr. Fletcher," Tony said during a quiet moment, "could you tell me about the Navy? I'm thinking about enlisting after I finish college." James looked at the earnest young face and saw something he'd almost forgotten, the hunger for guidance that had made teaching young sailors one of his favorite parts of military service. "What do you want to know?" he asked. "Everything," Tony said simply. So James began to talk. About leadership and responsibility. About the weight of making decisions when lives hang in the balance. About the brotherhood that forms between people who depend on each other for survival. About the pride that comes from serving something larger than yourself. As the weeks passed, James found himself becoming something he'd never expected to be again, a mentor. Tony wasn't his only student. The 2 young men from the robbery attempt, Marcus and Tyler, had taken James up on his offer of guidance. Officer Johnson had arranged for community service instead of charges, and James had volunteered to supervise their work at the store. Marcus, the tall one with the anchor tattoo, turned out to be a kid whose father had left when he was 10 and whose mother worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat. Tyler, shorter and stockier, had been kicked out of school for fighting and was struggling to get his GED. Neither of them was a criminal, they were just lost kids who'd made a desperate choice. James worked with them the way he'd once worked with young sailors, firm but fair, demanding excellence but providing the support to achieve it. He helped Marcus apply for community college courses and connected him with a veterans organization that offered scholarships for military families. He worked with Tyler on anger management techniques he'd learned from counseling struggling sailors, and helped him find a part-time job at a local auto shop. As the weeks passed, James found himself becoming something he'd never expected to be again, a mentor. Tony wasn't his only student. The 2 young men from the robbery attempt, Marcus and Tyler, had taken James up on his offer of guidance. Officer Johnson had arranged for community service instead of charges, and James had volunteered to supervise their work at the store. Marcus, the tall one with the anchor tattoo, turned out to be a kid whose father had left when he was 10 and whose mother worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat. Tyler, shorter and stockier, had been kicked out of school for fighting and was struggling to get his GED. Neither of them was a criminal, they were just lost kids who'd made a desperate choice. James worked with them the way he'd once worked with young sailors, firm but fair, demanding excellence but providing the support to achieve it. He helped Marcus apply for community college courses and connected him with a veterans organization that offered scholarships for military families. He worked with Tyler on anger management techniques he'd learned from counseling struggling sailors, and helped him find a part-time job at a local auto shop. Mike Gonzalez, the store manager, watched these changes with amazement. His quiet night shift worker had transformed the atmosphere of the entire store. Customers lingered longer, sales were up, and even the local police had started stopping by for coffee and conversation. "James," Mike said one evening, "I have to ask, why didn't you ever tell me about your military background? I mean, chief petty officer on a destroyer? That's impressive stuff." James considered the question while he arranged the magazine rack. "Because I didn't want it to matter," he said finally. "I wanted to be judged on what I did here, not on what I'd done before. And now? Now I'm realizing that experience isn't something to hide from. It's something to share." That night, as James locked up the store and headed home to his small apartment, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here. 3 years ago, he'd been a broken man trying to disappear into anonymity. Tonight, he was Chief Petty Officer James Fletcher again, not because someone had called him by his rank, but because he'd remembered what that rank really meant. It meant taking care of people. It meant turning boys into men and men into leaders. It meant serving something bigger than yourself, whether that was your country, your community, or just the scared kid standing in front of you who needed someone to believe in him. Officer Johnson had become a regular visitor to the store, not just for official business but because she valued James's insights on community policing and conflict resolution. She'd even invited him to speak at the police academy about de-escalation techniques and reading situations before they turn violent. Mrs. Rodriguez had become something of a surrogate mother to Tony, Marcus, and Tyler, bringing them home-cooked meals and treating them like the grandsons she'd never had. She'd also convinced James to start a weekly discussion group at the community center, where veterans could share their experiences and support each other through the challenges of civilian life. The convenience store that had once been James's hiding place had become the heart of a community that was learning to see each other, really see each other, for the first time. Mike Gonzalez had been so impressed with the positive changes that he'd promoted James to assistant manager and given him a significant raise. More importantly, he'd given James the freedom to continue his mentoring work during store hours, recognizing that it was bringing in customers and creating the kind of community atmosphere that money couldn't buy. James Fletcher had spent 3 years being invisible, but he'd learned something important in those dark months: you can't hide from who you are forever. Eventually, life calls you back to yourself. And when it does, you have a choice: you can answer that call with resentment and bitterness, or you can answer it with wisdom and grace. James had chosen wisdom. And in doing so, he discovered that the best part of his story wasn't behind him, it was just beginning. The old James Fletcher might have measured his success by the ships he'd commanded or the missions he'd completed. But the new James Fletcher measured his success differently, by the young man who'd earned a scholarship, by the 2 kids who'd turned their lives around, by the community that had learned to see the humanity in each other. He was still stocking shelves at QuickMart, still wearing a name tag that said, Jim, still earning a fraction of what he'd made in the Navy. But for the first time in 3 years, James Fletcher wasn't invisible. He was exactly where he belonged. Don't forget to subscribe to Heart Animal Stories for more incredible true stories that celebrate the unbreakable bonds between humans and the courage it takes to serve others. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that could restore your faith in humanity. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the most ordinary moments hold the most extraordinary people. Until next time, keep looking for the heroes hiding in plain sight.